Good morning. Good morning. I'm so glad to see you guys and have an opportunity to debrief over this week's news because it's yet another week of a lot of heavy headlines and we just need a moment to take a deep breath. And one of the ways that we've described SmartHER News over the years is a refuge from the storm, the storm that is the clutter and the partisanship of news. And I really feel that way this week. Like we all need a little bit of a break, a little bit of a refuge, time to actually digest some of these stories and talk a little bit about why they're important and really take your questions because we are navigating through a really significant period in history. We keep saying that, but sometimes it's difficult now because we sort of are in this period where this news cycle seems normal and it's not normal. I've been working in journalism in some capacity for almost 20 years. I've never been through a period like this where there's so many rapid fire headlines on so many really big topics that on any given night could drive a 2-hour documentary. And we're going to try to condense it into, 30-second sound bites. And that's very difficult to do. So today is an opportunity just to talk through some of the headlines, just spend a little more time together and answer your questions, really be a service. One of the things I was talking about this week is really getting back to SmartHER News' mission of being a service. News has become a stressor. We need to be a service and a service to you, especially during this time. So I find it a privilege and a pleasure to do this. This is like a highlight of my week in so many ways. It really is. I love talking to you guys directly. Those of you who are joining us live on Instagram and those who are watching us and listening to us later, it's just great to be able to connect with you this way. Real quick before I get to the news, I'd like to take a moment, if you'll allow me, to tell you a personal story that happened to me yesterday, because I really feel like there is a lesson in this story as a journalist and as a person. So yesterday I was having a really tough day. I was trying to do our reports. Sometimes I can do these reports pretty quickly, efficiently. It is not quick. It can take a couple hours, but I can get our news site and get everything up and going in a couple hours time period. I start the day at about 5 o'clock in the morning. And I just couldn't get it done. I just couldn't get our morning report done. I just couldn't get it across the finish line. And everything was going wrong. The FedEx guy decided to come in the middle of something. My kids were crying, and in the middle of a recording I was trying to do, down the driveway comes my car, driven by somebody else. My car was in the shop. I really love old cars. I've driven old cars for a lot of my life. In high school, I drove my father's 1958 Chevy. Okay, so I love old cars. And I have an old car, but old cars need a lot of care. And so it was in the shop, and the mechanic shop was just being nice. They just were like, oh, we'll just drop it by. They happened to drop it by during this time. The car is working. Everything seems to be great. I finish what I need to do. I take the car around the block a couple times just to check it out. This is a 1968 Chevy, so it is an old car. It's working fine. I'm like, you know what? My day's going to turn around. I'm going to go pick up my son from school. We're going to drive the car. I'm going to grab my computer. I'll do a little work. So I go inside, grab all my stuff, go out to the car, and it doesn't start. It doesn't start. And it just had all this work done. So this is crazy. And I just drove it. So it's not starting. It's sounding weird. I've never really heard this sound, and my mind is spiraling to a million different things about where it's never going to work. I bought a lemon. What a bad, all of that. I'm spiraling. So I called the guy that works at the shop and I'm explaining it to him. I'm thinking it's also my fault. I'm like, they think I'm like a bad woman driver. This is what's going on. And am I doing something wrong? Like maybe I'm doing something wrong. Anyhow, he swings by. He's like, I got to see. I also can't move the car, so we're going to need to tow it, if something's really wrong. So he comes by, he's sitting in the car. He's like, everything looks good. He's like, I don't really know what's going on. It sounds very strange. He's like, looks great. You got all your, everything's reading correctly. Your fuel gauge, you got a full tank, more than a full tank of gas. And I was like, yeah, I've got more than, yeah. I mean, I haven't filled it up recently. It's been in the shop. He's like, well, we didn't fill it up because it's full. Well, he climbs into the car and goes on the gas tank, and it's so obviously empty. The car's not working because the car's out of gas. The car is out of gas because the fuel gauge is broken. The fuel gauge has been showing a full tank for like the last 6 months. So, there's two takeaways from this. One is that when you're facing a problem, whatever it is, oftentimes it's the simplest variable that you have to check off your list. It's the most obvious thing you have to check off your list. And number two it's really easy to take things for granted as always being correct. I don't think I've ever questioned a fuel gauge. Like when I get into any car, if it shows me a half tank of gas, I think it's a half tank of gas. Like, why would I question that? When has a fuel gauge ever been wrong? Guess what? A fuel gauge can be wrong and you can be out of gas, and that's why your car's not starting. Put a little gas in that car, it ran great. It just turns out if you put gas in any car, old car, new car, it runs. It's amazing. Unless you got one of those electric cars, then I can't help you exactly. But it ended up working out just fine. I got to fix my fuel gauge. But tying that back to the news, I was really thinking about that when we're looking at some of these broader challenges, whether it's foreign policy, the pandemic, all of these things, we have very complicated conversations. We don't want to miss some of the simplest things that we have to cover. We do have to cover some of the basics. And we also don't want to take for granted things that have happened in the past as always being that way. You know, we take for granted the U.S. military is the most powerful military in the world. Guess what? It wasn't always that way. It wasn't always that way. Russia actually wasn't always Russia. It was the Soviet Union quite recently. You know, we were at war, World War II, just in the matter of a lifetime. A lot can happen, and the things that we take for granted as being always true still need to be double sourced. So, by the way, my husband always says that you should always drive around with nothing less than a half tank worth of gas, which is funny because he doesn't do that. Just a little secret. But it's because of an emergency, you can get several hundred miles on a full tank of gas. So there's a little bit of a smarter tip for you today. So we're all going to have to go fill up our gas tanks to make sure that we're ready to go. So let's cover some of the big news of the day and really the big news of the week. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what's going on at the U.S. southern border, because this is a story that's not getting a lot of coverage in news overall. In fact, we couldn't find major media news outlet that had written up the latest data coming from Customs and Border Protection this week. It just got passed by. Part of this is because Customs and Border Protection is releasing this data later and later every month, looking at the previous month. And so where you were expecting it in the first week of, let's say, January to find out what December looked like at the southern border, now you're waiting almost to the end of the month. And this has just sort of gradually happened over the last year or so. But the reason why we're looking at the border is that we've seen such historic numbers at the border of encounters. So let's talk about what encounters are. Encounters are people that are attempting to cross the U.S. southern border. Some will discuss this as illegal immigration. The reason why we use encounters is because if someone is coming across the border, even if it is illegally and they're seeking asylum, then they're becoming an asylum seeker, not an illegal immigrant in the eyes of U.S. law. And so actually calling it illegal immigration gets you into this funny territory. I know it feels like word acrobatics, but it's because of the law. So when we're talking about encounters, we're talking about people that are being encountered by Border Patrol. Some of them are being immediately expelled because of the pandemic policies that we have in place that's leading to an immediate expulsion. Others are allowed to stay and seek asylum. And it just depends case by case. So the big takeaway from the U.S. southern border from the month of December, and this is really important, is that we're still seeing these historic levels of encounters. Now, one encounter is to one person, but you could have 2 encounters a month of the same person. So that's also why we use that term encounters. And something that the Biden administration has attempted to point out that, well, encounters are up because people are being expelled immediately because of the pandemic. So they're attempting multiple times. And if they're attempting multiple times, then this problem is still important, but it's not quite as big as the numbers are reflecting. That would be the argument coming from the government. But it's very difficult. You're really sifting through a lot of data, and the momentum, the amount still is historic, even if you kind of, divide it up by 2 and cross, carry the 1 and all of that. So I want to show you what this looks like. Let me just pull up a little bit of a graph from, you know what? I actually need to send it to myself from my computer, which I didn't do. Let me go ahead and do that if you guys don't mind. I think it's important. I don't know if it's going to interrupt me though, so it may. Let me just tell you a little bit about what these numbers are. I had a couple graphics that I had separated out for you, but my phone was charging and I was waiting to airdrop it to myself. So that's the way it goes. But the bottom line is that you can see we're seeing a historic rise of numbers of encounters. So in the month of December alone, you're seeing 170,000 encounters. If you look back in previous years, 170,000 in a month would be historic at any point. We're seeing this almost every month, that we're seeing these really, really high numbers. And so we're talking about 5,000 encounters a day. I mean, that's the sort of pace that we're talking about. So the reason why this story is important is to understand that when we're talking about immigration and we're talking about, you're hearing these stories about what's happening at the border, oftentimes they're highly partisan. The big takeaway from this is that we're seeing historic levels. This really matters because the historic levels are continuing. Even if we're seeing a little bit of a decrease month to month on certain things like unaccompanied children and unaccompanied minors, you're still in very historic categories. Why is this a story that we're going to pay important attention to? Not only because of immigration and a humanitarian crisis and all the different ways that we can cover this. A couple of reasons. One is politically in America, especially in an election year, which we're in the midterm elections, the issue of the border and immigration is an issue that motivates voters. It's one of the reasons that we saw President Trump elected back in 2016. That was a huge issue for him, and that galvanized a certain group of voters for him. It has that capacity for liberals and conservatives to mobilize people. And so I don't want to lose sight of this story, even though it's not getting the attention it deserves, because I have a feeling it will become more important in the midterm elections and then in the presidential election cycle. Of course, you have all these different elements to this story as well, which is Homeland Security being one of them and how secure our borders are. And that's how I kind of want to tie this story to the larger story about what's happening in Europe, because how a nation defines its borders, how it establishes its borders, really ties to national identity, the way a nation views itself. And that's why we see such clashes when it comes to political conversations, because it's a clash of the way that people view America and our role and how we are supposed to behave around our borders. So let's take it to Europe. Let's take it to Eastern Europe, and let's talk about the border of Ukraine and Russia, because this is the border that's getting the most attention in the news. And the reason why this border is important is that in the past, that border wasn't as independent as it is right now, meaning that Ukraine, just similar to Belarus, and I'll pull up a map for you now, was part of the Soviet Union. And so now you have an independent country that at times was staying very close to Russia. You had leaders in Ukraine that were very close to Russia. And now you're in a generation where the leaders don't have such close relations and want to have closer relations with the West. So the border between, and you could kind of see it here on your screen, between Russia and Ukraine is where it's believed that there's more than 100,000 Russian troops. And Ukraine really is that block between Russia and the rest of Europe. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, these are the countries that recently joined NATO, the largest military alliance in the entire world. And those countries are bordering what we could call the northwest part of the Russian border. The Ukraine is on the southwest part of the Russian border. So Russia has felt this pressure of NATO expanding into countries that give it a very key strategic position to watch and monitor what's happening in Russia. Ukraine would be able to do the same if Ukraine joined NATO. And some of you actually had some great questions about Ukraine. Kim, you were asking, do we want Ukraine to join NATO? And Katie, you were asking, if Ukraine is not in NATO, why is NATO going on high alert? So let's talk about that. NATO is going into high alert because a country just crossing someone else's border and invading is really an act of war, right? If Russia marches into Ukraine and isn't stopped, then what stops Russia from marching in further to Western Europe? So it's partly because of a precedent. We respect borders. If I cross into Ukraine, I'm in their territory, their sovereign territory. If I cross into Russia, I'm in their sovereign territory. We respect these borders. The instant that there's not a respect to the borders, it starts shattering what is commonly agreed on territories. And that's where chaos can happen. If Russia just marches into part of Ukraine like they did a couple of years ago and say, actually, that's our territory, it's a slippery slope of, well, where does that stop? And what does that mean for Russia getting a better position if, let's just say a hypothetical, they take over the entire Ukraine, take over the entire country. Now they have an interesting strategic position that gives them closer reach into Europe if a conflict were to happen. So really, Ukraine is a block in a lot of ways for both NATO and for Russia. And that's why there's so much attention. NATO isn't a member of, Ukraine isn't a member of NATO because there is corruption in the government. There is a question about how close the relationships of some politicians are to Russia. There is a question about whether or not Ukraine shares the values of NATO, which include democracy and freedom, and it's going to stand up against an incursion from Russia, for example. And so it's not an easy process just to snap your fingers and get into NATO. Ukraine has to prove themselves that they're more aligned with the allies of NATO than they are with their past. And that's really what's taking place right now. So that's one of the reasons why when we're talking, these border conversations really matter. And it matters in a way when you're looking at this Eastern European situation where you can see that the border is everything. Everyone's watching this border to see if Russia comes across. One of the news items in recent 24 hours is that the State Department, joined by NATO, sent an official diplomatic letter to the Russian government stating their terms. We haven't heard any updates from that. I think the big takeaway from that is that diplomacy is continuing, despite a week when we're also seeing announcements that troops are ready. They're getting a higher degree of readiness of U.S. troops to join NATO forces if they would have to. Then we don't want to forget that while we have that announcement from the Defense Department, we also have diplomacy still taking place. What is this all about? A lot of you ask questions about World War III, because we are hearing that sort of are we on the brink of a large conflict? I don't know if there's any way to really be able to forecast that right now. We're going in, but we could take a look at timing. We are in a period right before the Olympics. There's a high degree of visibility on this issue. The question is, what is the trigger that turns it into a hotter conflict or allows both sides to take a break? Because sometimes that's what leaders need, is just cover for a moment to take a break and slow down. And so I don't know if that's something that can be actually generated from the U.S., for example, like a moment, a deadline, something like that, or it's something completely different from the outside where people get distracted and suddenly the temperature comes down a little bit. I think the opportunity for this story to go many different directions is there. And we have seen Russia in the past, when they say that they're going to do something, it's difficult for them to come off of it. So that's why President Biden, in a news briefing last week when he was answering questions, he got himself into a little bit of a trouble about this. We talked about this last week because he said, when he was asked about, well, what is the United States really prepared to do? He said, well, it really depends on what Russia does. And what he was trying to say essentially is, well, if they just come, if they're not making a huge invasion into Ukraine, we're not going to meet that huge invasion with an overwhelming show of force. It wouldn't warrant that, right? That's what he's trying to say, that there's different degrees of which the United States can engage. Others saw it as a opening for President Putin to misbehave just a little bit and just do a little something wrong. And that's where the president got into trouble. So we don't really know. When I got into trouble, there was a debate over what he said. We don't really know how Russia perceived that comment. One of the important things I do want to point out to you, though, is that when Russia was invading Ukraine and went into Crimea, which is traditionally a portion of Ukraine that has very close ties to Russia, and in some ways was kind of operated, what it sounded like is sort of like an independent provincial government that was very strong. That happened during President Obama's administration, and a lot of the people that were a part of President Obama's administration are now the people that are running President Biden's foreign policy. And so I want to keep that in mind. These are known entities to each other. President Putin has known President Biden for a long time. Secretary Blinken has been in these diplomatic circles. Wendy Sherman, these are names you're all hearing. These are very familiar faces. So they're not meeting each other for the first time. And I think that's an important fact to know. All right, real quick here, and then we'll get on to any of your questions that you have live now. There's been a lot of questions about monoclonal antibodies treatments and what happened this week by the FDA. And I wanted to address that real quick because some of you were asking about that. Deb, you were asking about when we could potentially see COVID-19 move to an endemic rather than an epidemic or a pandemic. We can talk about that. And Amy, you were asking about the emergency use authorization removed for monoclonal antibodies. So Here's the deal with that. Emergency use authorization goes into effect during a health emergency when there's a treatment that looks like it could potentially help. It doesn't have to be proven the same way that it could be proven in a typical approval process by the FDA. And monoclonal antibodies had that EUA, and they were being applied differently depending on where you lived. If you tested positive for the virus that causes COVID-19, and then you were to get more symptomatic and sick, certain patients would qualify for monoclonal antibodies. Here's the deal with monoclonal antibodies. At the beginning of the Omicron variant, the discovery of that, there's questions about whether or not they would be effective because of the mutations that are part of this particular variant. The FDA came out this week and said that they're withdrawing emergency use authorization for some of these monoclonal antibodies because they felt that they had limited effectiveness against Omicron, and so that they were limiting the use of these monoclonal antibodies. Places like Florida had very strong response to this because they've been really making sure that monoclonal antibodies are more widely available. And that's become a little bit of a political conversation. Are these more effective or less effective with the Omicron variant? It seems that they're less effective. Here's the problem, though. If you test positive for COVID and you end up getting sick, yes, based on your symptoms, we may be able to say, well, that seems more typical to be Omicron. You got a sore throat, you got a scratchy throat. That's very, very indicative of Omicron. But it's not like you didn't have a sore throat if you had Delta, and you're not getting checked for exactly what variant you have. And this is where the pushback is, which is, well, do we really want to do this now? We're still gathering information. Do we really know how widespread Omicron is? We thought it was more widespread a couple weeks ago than it really was. And we're always using estimates. So we're testing a certain batch of tests to see what the variant is. Based on that batch of tests, then we're extrapolating out and saying, oh, well, I'm just running a hypothetical. 8 out of 10 tests were positive for the Omicron variant. So that must mean 80% of the country that's sick or tested positive for the virus that causes COVID has Omicron. There's a better calculation formula than that, but that's how it's being done. And so that's a question. If I had to ask the FDA, I'd had an opportunity to, I would say, do we really want to do this now? Are we really certain it isn't effective? Does it hurt people? Does it hurt people if they get it and it wasn't appropriate for the variant that they have? So I'm curious about the timing of it. That's where my mind would be, which is, hey, we actually have very limited treatments that have emergency use authorization. Do we want to limit it? What is that all about? Maybe they have a better idea about how these antibodies can be used more effectively. But that's the question that I would be asking, because emergency use authorization is about getting something that could be effective and not be harmful, and that could be helpful, because that's where we want it to be, because we want to get past this pandemic. So let's get to endemic and epidemic. That was one of the questions that you were asking as well. An endemic is something like malaria in Africa. It's something that's always present that you have to deal with. And that's where people think SARS-CoV-2 is going to be for us, that it's going to be endemic. It's going to be present. It may not be an epidemic. So epidemic is something like the AIDS epidemic. It was a strong virus in a certain community. Epidemic has a certain more urgency to it, where endemic doesn't as much. It's like, this is going to be here. We're going to have to deal with it. We're going to learn how to treat it. Epidemic's a little bit different than that. Pandemic is about presence. It's not about severity. So we could have a pandemic of roses all over the world. Let's do something like that. That's a pandemic. If it's all over the world, that's why when you hear terms, and I'm not getting political here, but I do think it is important to mention this, the White House has talked about a pandemic of the unvaccinated. That's like saying it's a pandemic of women, or a pandemic of children, like a pandemic of redheads. Like, a pandemic isn't a pandemic of a certain group. An epidemic could be that way, maybe, but a pandemic is when it's everywhere. And that's why it's very few things that are pandemics. So just want to make that clear. Do you guys have any questions on anything I can answer as we're kind of going into Friday? I like to not bother you on Fridays because I feel like by Friday we're all just kind of making it. I'd love to be the sort of person that's so present in every moment and so grateful in every moment that Friday is just another day. But to me, Friday's not just another day. I get real excited Thursday afternoon. Like, I love Thursdays. So I like to debrief you, give you some of this stuff at this point, so then you can listen to it if you'd like on the weekend. But I also like to leave you alone. So if there's anything that I could help with now before we go, I would love to. And I'm going to look at a couple of your questions because some of you had some great questions as well about vaccine mandates. And I'd like to touch on that because we talked about it a little bit yesterday about what we're seeing with legal challenges to that. By the way, if you're watching live, I just want to mention to you, so on Instagram Lives, you can buy a badge. I've just trying this out, and basically it's like dropping a quarter in a tip jar, and it goes to supporting SmartHER News and our mission. And I'm going to be trying out a couple different things because I've really run into some obstacles on social media over the last couple months. And one of my resolutions for 2022 is that I don't repeat the same mistakes that I have over the last couple of years. I've gathered information on what it's like to run a company, a news platform, and where is best to put different content. And so I love being able to interact with you live. And this is just one way that we're trying to figure out, well, how do we keep everything completely free on SmartHER News on the website? How does that actually work? And so against my better judgment, I'm trying badges because I thought, well, let's just see what happens. I mean, we might as well just see what happens while we're doing this. So thank you so much for your support. If you're watching after this, you're not going to be able to buy a badge, but we'll have some different ways that you can support us that we'll talk about over the next couple of weeks. So even just thinking about it, that makes me feel good. I really appreciate it. So, Christina, you had a question about mandates for healthcare workers. Is there a chance that it will end? And Seaweave, you said, can the decision for vaccine mandates for healthcare workers be changed? So a couple things on this, okay? We've talked about the federal government mandates, the Supreme Court blocking the one for companies that have 100 or more employees. We have this other federal mandate that's for federal workers and contractors. That looks like it is being appealed. Likely will make it to the Supreme Court unless the Biden administration decides that they don't want to pursue it. And they could do that. They could be like, okay, never mind. You know, and that's a real something. We talked about this yesterday. If you didn't watch us on our coffee talk video that we did in the morning, it's really something I want you to keep in mind. We are getting mandates from the government. And when a mandate comes from the government and not from elected officials and it's not legislation, it also can be changed very easily. And this is where the tension is with a vaccine, because a vaccine doesn't get changed. If you get a vaccine and you feel compelled to get it because you're worried about losing your job, and then the mandate that you were expecting doesn't happen, it's not like you can rewind time. And this is where individuals do have questions about that. And I think we should recognize it. And there is a question if they could have, if they could take legal action against the government if it's found that the mandate wasn't constitutional, but they felt compelled to do it anyways. It would be, I think that would be tough. We're going to need a bunch of lawyers to look through that, but I think it's interesting. The way that these mandates are different, though, the federal government mandate applying to healthcare workers that work in facilities that take federal money, which is most facilities, that was allowed to stand by the Supreme Court because it was basically, it was looked at as within government authority. Hey, you're getting government money. This is a pandemic. These are healthcare workers. We're going to allow that if you're working in this facility, you're going to need to get a vaccine. Some of these other vaccine mandates are coming down from the state. And if you're a healthcare worker and you'd like to jump in on this, love to hear from you because you can speak to this better than anybody. These come from the state, where the state is saying to a hospital, you have to require this of your workers. In the past, those type of mandates have been allowed to stand. So this also applies, some of you have asked, like out in California, my home state, love you guys out there, miss the ocean. We'll talk about that another time. I know you've been obviously navigating something very, very unique in California. Every state has a different experience. In Texas, I'm not worried about the governor mandating a vaccine for school children. The governor came out and said, we're not doing it. So as a parent, I'm not even thinking about that. I don't have to think about that right now. If you're in California and you have any questions, there's been announcements about mandating vaccines. Vaccine mandates in the state level have passed precedent when it comes to a legal basis. So they've been able to stand in the past. Here's the asterisk to all of this. I'm going to go down a road. I don't know where it's going to lead us, but I want us to go down it together. So take my hand. Here we go. We're going to walk. We're going to walk down this road. Vaccine mandates in a pandemic or anything related to a health emergency gives the government, local, state, federal, more leeway to move because it's an emergency situation. So the government's going to step in, they're going to be strong, and they're going to say one thing, and they're going to pursue it. When you're not in a health emergency, there can be more room. for legal challenges and the like, because it's not urgent it's not considered urgent for the community. That's one of the things we're going to have to really watch, especially over the next couple months and really over the next year, because we're going to have to try to see what does this virus look like over a year's time period with so many people now with prior infection and so many people vaccinated. Are we still in a health emergency? And what does that allow governments to do? Now, governments in the past on a state level can mandate certain vaccines, or counties can. My kids still have to have a certain number of vaccines if they're going to public school. That's able to stand. And we're not in a measles emergency. It just is what it is. And that's been one of the concerns about challenges to the COVID-19 vaccine, about whether or not it could set a precedent for vaccines that we've taken for granted that people have thought have been successful. I know there's a lot of different opinions on vaccines. I'm just trying to give you the overview. If that could also challenge some of the things that, again, we've always thought were just in place. So what I would say is that when it comes to state, like more of a local government, as well as a private business, they can put mandates in effect, and we have seen those mandates upheld in a health emergency. The question is, and we've seen them upheld without a health emergency. The question is, what do those look like when the pandemic changes and we're not in an emergency? So what my advice would be, no matter who, just based on the news and also being a mother trying to navigate this, it's very easy. I don't know about you. Have you guys had those dinners? Sitting outside, socially distanced, of course, dinners with family and friends where everybody's yelling about something about related to the pandemic, this policy, that policy, what you're doing it wrong, you're doing it right, all of this stuff. At the end of the day, I sort of sit there and I'm like, it all can change. That's the thing. It can all kind of change, and it will. And so where we're at with it, I'm not sure. Let's go ahead and see if you guys have any questions that I can answer for you guys. I love that some of you, if you're, I know if a lot of you watch later, but I love that some of you now know each other on our Instagram lives, which is really nice that you guys are joining in community. I had Emily, who works for us in Paris. She's doing a year where she's working. She just got out of college, and she's been a great help for us. Hey, Emily, hopefully you're watching. I'm going to test you on this later. No, I'm not. She does some work in her, her spare time for us still. And she actually is putting together a really cool, this is what life's like in Paris, because she had to get vaccinated and boosted if she was going to continue her work there, not for SmartHER News, but for what else she's doing. And she's going to show us what life is like what is life like in Paris. But she was saying that she was sitting in a cafe, and she was talking to a woman, and the woman in Paris knew of SmartHER News. So there's our global reach. There is our global reach. Katie, what mascara do you use? Thank you, Katie. Most important question. I mean, really, let's get away from this stuff and talk about what's really matters, which is actually sharing tips about what helps us live smarter. I vary through mascaras, but my oldie but goodie is always Maybelline with the pointy. You got to get the pointy applicator, the rubber pointy applicator. You can't get the traditional one. Really important. Side note. All right, guys. Emily in Paris. Yes, it is like the show. I don't think it's like the show. I've never seen that show, but I don't know if Emily's living that sort of life. I think Emily is very studious and serious and wonderful. So there we go. All right, guys, let me just double check to make sure if there's any other questions that I can answer for you that you wrote in about. That was a really great one. Not to switch back to a very serious topic, but I do think this is worthwhile. We did cover it on our website, but you may not have seen it. And in fact, I might put it on a shorter report later. We are seeing a series of different ISIS attacks in Syria and Iraq. The U.S. is involved. You have U.S. soldiers, upwards of 200, that are supporting the forces on the ground that battle ISIS, which includes Kurds, for example. But we're involved. So we haven't seen any really engagement that we've really talked about that has made it to the news. I don't know what's happened, off the record in a long time. And what Lisa was asking about is, what are the big takeaways? I think the big takeaway is that it is happening. It's happening again. And ISIS is attempting a prison break. They're engaging again in parts of the world where we've already put a lot of troops and investment. So Let me go say if there's anything else. Katie, I had to reload the video. What mascara does she use? I'm just saying that Maybelline is one of my go-tos. I don't know if that's what I used today. The other one, if you want something more expensive, is Marc Jacobs. But the small travel size. Don't get the big size. Doesn't work as well. The small size. But Maybelline is always the good one with the pointy applicator. Let's end with this question. Maddie's asking about Novavax vaccine status. Thank you for that. Really important, and thank you for putting me onto this story again. We're going to continue to check other vaccine status. There's a ton of vaccines that are in development. And this week there's been announcements by the major pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer that they're testing vaccines that would be more effective with Omicron. So what does that mean? I don't know. But there are other vaccines that are not using the same mRNA technology that has been controversial in the past amongst certain circles, and are using more quote unquote traditional vaccines to try to battle this coronavirus. In the past, we haven't seen vaccines that are particularly effective against coronaviruses. One of the questions with mRNA vaccines, there's been a lot of hope around them, but one of the questions was about how stable they are. How long would they last? How effective would they be? And one of the things you need to know about testing vaccines, it doesn't matter what sort of technology, is that it really relies on what infection looks like in the community. So we need a certain amount of infection in a strange way to test these vaccines, to know that if I was participating in a trial, that I don't know if I got the placebo or I got the vaccine, they would want me to be able to be in a community where I am going to have exposure to the virus to see how effective it actually is. And that's one of the ways that you test a vaccine, which sounds so like, oh, but how do you know if someone interacts with, gets a big dose of exposure or not? Like, there's some unknown with that. They do a lot of other stuff under a microscope, but I'm also mentioning that because I think that's an important thing to think about when we're talking about vaccine efficacy. And I wonder, one of the questions I'd have for Dr. McCary or Dr. Rutland or Dr. Dari, we have talked to so many great doctors, is do we ever lose really good research of understanding how good and effective a vaccine is if there's just been so much infection in a community? If so many people have natural immunity, does that lessen our understanding of how effective a vaccine can be because we've had exposure to the virus and our immune systems are primed with that as well? And we know that there's people that have prior infection that also have the vaccine. And now, so how do we test more vaccines if there's all of these dynamics at play? I'll get an answer on that, and then we'll go from there. All right, Carissa Danielle, 4 stars. This is something I'd love to end on. She says, imperfect humans all trying to do our best with the resources we have. Danielle, that was dropping knowledge for us today. Thank you. I think that is a really good takeaway. Real quick about, Jamie Lee, that's a great question. There's rumors that President Biden may appoint Vice President Harris to the Supreme Court. Okay, real quick on this, because Margaret Brennan, CBS News, actually did an interview with the vice president that aired in late December. And she says she has no interest in the Supreme Court. She's on record for saying that. So just want to introduce, I don't know what President Biden's going to do. And by the way, Stephen Breyer's retirement, I know it's everywhere. And people are I even saw the Wall Street Journal just like Stephen Breyer's retirement. He hasn't announced his retirement yet. This poor guy. Maybe he didn't even want to this week. Maybe he wanted to wait a little bit. This is the one piece of news that I will address. Very few pieces of news will I ever address according to reports. Sources say. I don't really go there. I just wait. 24 hours and then it's on the record. But with the Supreme Court, this is often the way that it is. There is this being done where there's a little bit of like priming the audience for it. Now, I would not have covered reports of this if it was happening within the last year of the Biden administration, because some political forces try to pressure Supreme Court justices to retire before their president, whether it's Democrat or Republican, so that they get to choose who's on the Supreme Court next, who they're going to nominate next before the new guy gets in. And so if this was happening within the last year, like the last year of the Biden administration, I would have waited. I wouldn't have covered it. because then you're like, is this part of a media? Is someone planting this story because they're pushing Breyer out because they want to get him out before President Biden leaves office? But Justice Breyer is 83. He's been serving a long time. It's not crazy for him to think about retiring at this moment where, we're 2 solid years ahead of a presidential cycle, although I know presidential cycles begin soon. So I think it's worth talking about what could happen. So yes, the president can nominate whoever they want, really. And typically that nomination, void of any really strong controversy. Obviously you saw some with Justice Kavanaugh and even Justice Coney Barrett. It can be disruptive, but it didn't stop their confirmation. So we'll see. There could be also a reason for Justice Breyer to try to retire now, because if President Biden was able to nominate someone and get them across the finish line before the midterm elections, this is key, because there's a question about whether or not Democrats hold the Senate. It would be easier to get someone through if you have the Democrats holding the Senate with the tiebreaker of the vice president than if you have midterm elections and Republicans get the majority, which we don't know if they would, but if they did. So there could be a political calculation that even a Justice Breyer could be thinking about. Justice Breyer's been really outspoken about making sure that the court isn't political. And there's a lot of talk about the court being political, but that's usually coming from media sources, just as an aside. So just be aware of that. So just a couple things to know. All right, great to see you guys. Thank you so much for all the support. I really appreciate it. And we're going to continue to talk about all these big stories. You can catch all of them on smarternews.com throughout the week. I always want to make sure that you know that website exists, that you can check there. If you need a break from social media, you can do that. You also can sign up for our longer pieces like this on our YouTube channel, which is great. You can, even with your YouTube channel, you can just subscribe to YouTube. They can send you the video in the morning. So then you don't even have to worry about like jumping on Instagram. And I'm just trying to think about ways to make this really easy for you so that you can get the news that you need, move on with your life, and love the news again. It shouldn't be that the news is aggravating to you all the time. And also, you don't need the news 24/7. I mean, I'll talk about developing stories. But you know what? You take a break, come back in a couple hours, you get caught up. It's okay. You can miss a couple days. And that's why we really try to focus on small bites, high quality. Because small bites of high quality information over the course of a week or a couple months, I mean, you're ahead of the game. And that's just what I want from you. So thank you so much for everything. Thank you so much as well for those of you who have contributed on the badges. I really appreciate that. And that support goes a really long way as we're trying to drive Smarter News into its 4th year. Remember what I said at the beginning. Check your fuel gauge. Check your fuel gauge. We'll start with that metaphor and we'll end with it. All right, guys, have a great day. Keep the questions coming, and always more on smarternews.com. I'll see you soon.